Let's just move on to some more general kind of notions that these Republican administrations that they held. First of all, the cabinets of the various presidents, Harding and Coolidge here, would work as much as possible for reductions in government. They wanted to trim the federal budget. They wanted to retire as much of the debt that remained from World War I as possible. They wanted to reduce taxes, and especially taxes on corporate profits, personal incomes, and inheritances. So, having instituted the income tax and used that during the First World War, part of the return to normalcy entails trying now not to get rid of the income tax, but to reduce it to very minimal levels. Congress goes along. Much of the economic policy, though, of both the administrations would be driven by a figure who's going to become very important a little bit down the road when we reach the Great Depression, and that's Herbert Hoover. Herbert Hoover would act as Secretary of Commerce for these Republican administrations, and in doing so, he put forward an idea of government's role that you might refer to as associationalism. Associationalism. And what that entails is using government not to regulate, but using government in a voluntary and cooperative system to help bring order to the economy. In other words, to use government when both sides wanted government's assistance to reach, for instance, agreements between labor and employers or among employers within various industries, to try and rationalize the economy in a very progressive sort of way here. And I think it does sound progressive, that you want to remove risk, you want to rationalize, you want to rely on experts who know the statistics and they know the studies to help the American economy be as productive as it can possibly be. So that, and this is worth noting here, under Hoover's idea, it's not a forced legalistic approach to government taking a role in society. It's a voluntary approach, but it does reserve a role for government in America's economy. Now, it's a role because of deregulation and other things. It's a role that's probably going to help some groups more than others. Those groups that stand to benefit most. But nonetheless, I want to just take a moment and note that you're still talking about a certain level of activism here. And avoiding risk, stabilizing the economy, something that we saw even with the Federal Reserve. Regulatory commissions would be used, often staffed by business people, much as commissions and agencies were used to regulate the economy during the First World War. But again, it's voluntary. It's not a mandate. You also have a Supreme Court during the early 1920s that's very much about narrow definitions of government. William Howard Taft, 1921, becomes the Chief Justice, and under his tenure we'll have legislation regarding minimum wages for women workers rolled back, declared unconstitutional. We'll have legislation about child labor rolled back or struck down, and a ruling that associations, these cooperative efforts by business to stabilize the economy and to, in some ways, mark out their territories and establish price standards and those kind of things, the court declared that was not a breach of antitrust legislation, that it wasn't something that was unconstitutional. So again, you have this potential for deregulation and a more voluntary approach and use of government to keep business stable. Still some progressive ideas there, but brought out in a different way, more going back perhaps even to Roosevelt and beyond with some of these ideas. We also see this seemingly hands-off approach that hides a certain activism in foreign policy. And I think foreign policy in this case, in the 1920s, reflects well sort of the domestic ideas at work in the Harding, but most importantly, the Coolidge administration. And I think it's Coolidge who's working hardest probably for like revenue reductions and those kinds of things and gets those accomplished. But in terms of foreign policy, I just want to mention a few things. And one of them is a very early conference in 1921, the so-called Washington Conference. Now, 1921 is an important year because it's during this year that Congress declares the First World War over, and the Secretary of State proceeds to negotiate treaties with the combatants, with the belligerent states. Remember that the Versailles effort had failed. Wilson had failed to get approval from the Senate. So the result is the U.S. has to sign separate peace treaties with all of the offending states. It reflects this notion, I think, that the United States wants the benefits but not the responsibilities of Versailles. In other words, they want the peace. We want a peace that does certain things, but the United States is not willing to enter into an agreement that binds the United States in terms of foreign policy to act whenever called upon to act. We will make our own decisions. And I think it's that spirit that the U.S. is not withdrawing from foreign issues, but it's saying we're going to encounter or we're going to deal with these foreign issues on our own terms. And that sort of gets into a concept that I guess is worth mentioning. A term that you might hear in regard to the 1920s is isolation. But I think isolation is a bit too strong a term. The United States during the 1920s is not isolated or isolationist. In fact, the United States, I would argue, and you can disagree, you're welcome to, but I think the United States is active in foreign affairs, active in world and international events, and active diplomatically. But again, it's an activity or activism that is very subtle, very restrained, and very limited. The U.S. does not wish to enter into any kind of agreements or take any kind of action that will ultimately lead the United States to greater responsibilities that could potentially pull the United States, for instance, back into problems in Europe or problems in Asia or elsewhere that are beyond the limited, that go beyond the limited scope the U.S. is willing to accept. So we signed separate treaties with the belligerents. But back to the Washington Conference in 1921, in an attempt to avoid a costly armaments race as nations around the globe begin rebuilding or strengthening their own navies, the United States seeks a 10-year moratorium on naval construction. We don't want to put the money into building a huge navy while both Britain and Japan are actively engaged in naval construction. This Washington Conference in 1921 will lead to the so-called Five Powers Pact in 1922, and the Five Powers Pact establishes ratios for tonnage for different nations. So for every 5 tons the United States will have in its Navy, Britain will have 5 tons. Japan will be allowed 3 tons under this treaty, and France and Italy each will be allowed 1.75 tons. So that was kind of the ratios, or those were the ratios that were to govern the construction of naval armament, thereby allowing the United States to seek to control the size of the world's navies, but at the same time not entering into any sort of agreement that would require the United States to actively stop or enforce or in any other way become engaged. All sides promised to respect territories in the Pacific and to work together to prevent aggression worldwide. And speaking of aggression, this brings us to one of my personally favorite treaties, the so-called KelloggBriand Pact of 1928, the KelloggBriand Pact of 1928. In 1927, the United States was asked by France to join an alliance against a resurgent Germany. 1927. Now, remember for just a moment that the Treaty of Versailles, which the United States rejected, which we refused to sign off on, had included as part of its mechanisms the construction or creation of the League of Nations, a body to deal with aggression. But the U.S. had said no. Instead of engaging with the League, instead of committing ourselves to any kind of world enforcement against aggression, the United States accepts France's request to consider an individual treaty. U.S. Secretary of State Frank Kellogg proposes a treaty outlawing war as an instrument of national policy. Now, if you didn't hear what I just said, let me repeat that. Frank Kellogg proposes a treaty outlawing war as an instrument of national policy. In August of 1928, 14, that's a 1 and a 4, 14 powers signed the treaty. Later, some 48 other nations would sign the KelloggBriand Pact, promising not to use war as an instrument of national policy. There was no enforcement power included in the treaty. In other words, if someone did choose to use war, there was no enforcement mechanism to stop them, no enforcement sort of concert that the other nations would join together and beat the pulp out of this other nation that used force. Instead, there was nothing. Instead, it was moral force. It was public opinion. If you break the treaty, you're going to look bad. Again, the United States wasn't without activity in the international affairs of the world, but the U.S. refused to get involved when it meant action. Is that isolationism? Not quite. Not quite. Pretty close. But I think it suggests the larger tenor of these Republican administrations of the 1920s, both at home and abroad. Limited role for government. You don't want too much involvement, but you're willing to work for positive results when involvement is not involved. Positive results through volunteer efforts. Association rather than the powers of regulation. I'm going to leave it there, and we'll pick up in the next segment with a discussion of the economics of the 1920s, and then we'll move into the culture of the Jazz Age.